Have you ever kept a family secret for decades? I won't ask what, just curious.
At the family barbecue, the smell of charcoal clung to the air and the chatter of voices mixed with the faint squeal of children running through the yard. But none of that drowned out the moment when my parents, standing shoulder to shoulder with proud smiles, raised their glasses to honor my sister Megan's latest promotion. Their words flowed like a rehearsed speech, filled with admiration for her drive, her brilliance, her endless talent, and everyone around the picnic table clapped as if they were in the audience of a play. I stood there holding an empty plate, nodding politely, pretending I was busy with napkins and condiments so that no one would notice the way my jaw tightened with every glowing phrase. Not once did my name cross their lips, not once did they acknowledge that I too had worked hard, that I had survived setbacks and made achievements of my own, even if they weren't wrapped in a glossy title or accompanied by a six-figure salary. In that instant, I was invisible. Erased from the celebration of family, left to hold the paper plates while Megan bathed in applause. I cleared the table quietly, collecting forks sticky with barbecue sauce and half-empty cups of beer, while laughter swelled behind me. To an outsider, I must have looked dutiful, even helpful, but inside my thoughts weren't soft or forgiving. They were sharp, deliberate, almost surgical in the way I revisited years of neglect, birthdays forgotten, achievements dismissed, and conversations that ended with my parents pivoting back to Megan as if I were simply a warm body filling a chair. I remember the sting of childhood competitions, the way my report cards, no matter how clean, were brushed aside with a comment about how Megan was the gifted one, the one destined for bigger things, while I was merely steady. I had smiled back then, but even children know when they're being measured against an impossible yardstick. At the barbecue, my aunt nudged me and said with a laugh that Megan was surely going to outshine us all, maybe even land herself in a magazine spread one day, and I answered with a joke, light and casual, but it was the kind of joke that hides teeth beneath its grin. Nobody noticed. They never notice. They sip their drinks, they laugh, they bask in the glow of my sister's supposed brilliance, while I keep moving plates and glasses, blending into the background like the hired help. But silence, when chosen carefully, isn't weakness. It's strategy. I didn't argue, I didn't interrupt, I didn't demand space. I gathered crumbs and sticky knives, and in doing so I gathered something far heavier, the weight of every slight, every dismissal, every proud smile that skipped over me and landed squarely on Megan. By the time I stacked the last plate near the sink, my resolve was hard enough to slice through steel. That evening, when the guests had long gone and my parents probably sat smug in their living room replaying the glow of Megan's celebration, my phone buzzed with a message. It was from Megan, and the words lit up against the darkness of my bedroom like a flare, "Mom's in tears." "What did you do?" I stared at it for a long time, rereading, my lips curling into the faintest smile. It was almost funny that she asked, because the truth was I had done very little, at least nothing loud, nothing you could point to and label as sabotage. What I did was far subtler, far quieter, and it had begun long before that barbecue. The groundwork was already there, laid out over years of silence and observations, small details tucked away in the corners of family gatherings, truths spoken in hushed tones that people thought I wasn't listening to. Clearing the table had only been symbolic. What I was really clearing was the illusion of harmony that my parents had worked so hard to project. They toasted Megan with champagne, but I held something far stronger, the knowledge of where the cracks already existed and how easily they could be widened. So when Megan's text arrived, panicked and bewildered, I leaned back against my pillows and thought about the long game. Because the night of the barbecue was never about barbecue at all. It was about finally, silently, pulling the thread that would unravel the tapestry they had stitched together, the one where Megan was always the shining star and I was just the dim outline in the background. And while they clapped for her that afternoon, none of them realized that by sundown the real story had already begun, and I was the one writing it. I didn't answer her text, not right away. Instead, I let the silence stretch, because sometimes silence is the loudest reply. And as I set my phone face down on the nightstand, I whispered to myself, almost amused, almost relieved, "You want to know what I did?" Let's rewind. When I say it started long before the barbecue, I do not mean a single dramatic moment with a slammed door and a declaration of war. I mean a slow-burn apprenticeship in being overlooked that began in a living room with beige carpet and a television that was always just a little too loud, where my parents kept a wall of framed photos that told a very specific story about our family. One where Megan's kindergarten stars and science fair ribbons occupied the bright center, while my debate medals and music certificates drifted to the dim edges near the thermostat, and even as a kid I understood that you can live in the same house and still be edited out of the narrative. I learned early how to read the room, to hear which compliments landed with sparkle and which landed with a dull thud, to know that steady would always be the label pinned to my chest while brilliant hovered over Megan's head like a stage light. And I grew fluent in the kind of humor that keeps you likable while you are quietly bleeding, because if you keep people laughing, they rarely notice you have questions, and if you keep moving plates and solving problems, they call you dependable, which sounds flattering until you realize it means they expect you to hold the weight without asking for help or applause. There was the birthday party where I turned 16 and my mother, flustered and beautiful in a dress she claimed was on sale, forgot the candles and improvised with sparklers that sputtered out before I could blow a wish. And when I shrugged and laughed because the cake tasted the same without drama, my dad patted my shoulder and told me I had the heart of a team player, which was his way of saying thanks for not making this awkward, and 5 minutes later they were discussing whether Megan should apply to an early college program because she just has that extra gear, while I stacked paper plates and learned the first law of our house, which is that resilience becomes your only party trick when no one leaves you another option. There was the high school award night where the principal mispronounced my name twice, and my mother corrected him while also whispering to a neighbor that Megan's piano solo would be the showstopper, and there was the morning I left for my first real job interview, and my dad snapped a photo on his phone outside the front door, saying he wanted to remember this because you never know, then never printed it, never shared it, never found it again when I asked years later. As if misplacing moments was just a family habit and not a choice. So when the barbecue toast slid across the table like a well-worn script and my name stayed missing, I did not need anyone to translate what it meant, and I also did not need to shout to make a point, because I had already learned that quieter tools often cut cleaner, which is why, after rinsing the last fork and pretending not to hear my aunt announce that Megan should really start a podcast since people are drawn to winners, I drove home and opened the box under my bed that still smelled faintly like printer ink and old books, the one with my college letters, 2 plaques wrapped in tissue, and a thin folder of press clippings no one in my family had ever asked to see. I spent an hour at my desk scanning what mattered and naming the files carefully so they would display in order, and then I created a tidy shared album labeled Family Milestones, because I am not a monster, and I put Megan's glossy features in there too. The graduation caps, the corporate headshot, the smiling team in matching polos, except I also added the alumni newsletter where my project launched ahead of schedule for a hospital system, and I added the small local piece where my name sat beside a photograph of a ribbon cutting, and because long memories can be useful, I added a home video digitized from a dusty camcorder where my father, 10 years younger and a little softer around the eyes, tells us on a Sunday morning that he wants both his girls to know they are equally valued in his house, no exceptions, and the camera shakes when my mother laughs and says she will frame that promise next to the family photos. When the album looked clean and reasonable and almost painfully fair, I did not post it with a scream or a pointed caption. I attached it to a cheerful group email addressed to the cousins and aunts who always ask for pictures after gatherings, and I wrote that since everyone kept losing links, here was a single place to keep the good stuff, and would they please send anything I missed, because I wanted this to be complete for Grandma before her next checkup. I included, 3 lines down where it would look incidental, a short note saying that the alumni newsletter had come out last month and somehow I had forgotten to share, which was both true and untrue, because sometimes forgetting is the only way to preserve your sanity. Then I hit send, turned off my computer, and returned to my kitchen where the smell of smoke from the barbecue still clung to my hair, and I poured myself water and waited without really waiting, because if you set a room upright and open the window, the draft will eventually announce itself. By mid-morning, the replies began rolling in with the force of a small weather system, and there were the cousins with the fire emojis I could not see but could imagine. There was Aunt Carol asking why on earth no one mentioned my hospital project at the barbecue, since that seems huge, honey, and there was Uncle Nate, who always goes straight to the point, asking my parents whether the toast had a part 2 they forgot to deliver because he would like to propose it retroactively at Thanksgiving. I did not write any of them back, because you do not tug a thread while it is lengthening on its own, and besides, my phone was already vibrating with a new message from Megan asking if I had intended to embarrass Mom, which was a wild accusation for someone who had just been handed applause like a bouquet, so I told her the truth, which is that I created a folder for the family and included everything I could find. And if transparency stings, then maybe the glare is not my fault. The small revenge, if you insist on calling it that, was not the album itself, but the way it nudged people to look at the wall of our family narrative and notice the blank spaces shaped like me, which forced my parents to answer questions they had successfully dodged for years. And when Megan texted that Mom was in tears and Dad had gone silent, I felt a complicated pang that was not triumph exactly, but definitely not guilt. And I typed that I was sorry she was upset, but also that I was done being invisible, and I hit send knowing that the real fireworks were not the tears, but the phone call that would come after. The one where Dad's voice would be steady in that careful way, and he would ask if I had told anyone about the other thing. The one nobody ever puts in albums, and that, as they say, is when the fuse truly catches. The funny thing about revenge, at least the kind that lasts longer than a single outburst, is that it rarely looks like fireworks in the moment. It looks like patience, like small and deliberate movements that no one notices until suddenly the air feels charged. And people are looking around wondering who struck the match. By the time my parents clinked their glasses and announced to the yard how proud they were of Megan, I had already been setting the stage in ways they never imagined. Ways so subtle they could be confused with nothing more than good housekeeping, a little extra effort. A passing comment made at the right time and then left to hang like a seed in the breeze. I had learned long ago that if you press too hard, people push back, but if you lay a truth down quietly and step away, they water it themselves until it grows into something undeniable. In the weeks before the barbecue, I had been fielding phone calls from cousins and aunts, the kind of catch-up conversations where they ask how work is going and whether I'm dating anyone worth introducing at Christmas. Instead of brushing those questions off with vague answers like I usually did, I gave them just enough detail to make them curious, and then I laughed at myself like it was nothing, like maybe they were reading too much into it, which of course only made them want to know more. I mentioned the hospital system project that had gone live ahead of schedule, the one my boss swore had saved them thousands, and I did it casually, while complaining about traffic or my coffee machine breaking down, so that later, when they asked around, the discovery would feel like their own. People trust what they feel they've uncovered more than what they are told outright. Then there was the conversation with Megan's fiancé, who, despite his clean suits and too wide smile, has a habit of leaving his ears open when he thinks no one is paying attention. I made sure he overheard me on the phone one evening, talking about budgets and bonuses, dropping just enough figures to suggest my stability was not only real but quietly thriving, while his future wife's shine was perhaps not as flawless as her Instagram caption suggested. I never lied. I simply rearranged the truth into sharper angles and let his imagination do the rest. Later, when he mentioned it to Megan, she laughed it off, but doubt doesn't vanish once it's introduced. It lingers like smoke even when the fire is gone. The day of the barbecue itself, I played the role I had rehearsed my entire life, the dependable daughter who clears plates, refills glasses, laughs at jokes that sting. What they didn't notice was the way I placed certain stories into the air, like cards on a table. When Aunt Carol asked about Megan's upcoming move, I tilted my head and said I hoped it wouldn't be too stressful since she had already been working so many weekends. And I layered it with just the right amount of concern to make it sound sincere rather than critical. When Uncle Nate asked me about work, I shrugged, said it was fine, and mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that my department had been recognized in an industry journal, though I doubted anyone cared about that sort of thing. The trick was always to sound unimpressed with myself, to let them be the ones who insisted it was worth recognition. By dessert, the whispers had begun, tiny rumbles of comparison that parents dread but rarely address head-on. Why hadn't Robert and Linda mentioned both daughters in their toast? Wasn't it odd that Megan's fiancé seemed a little stiff whenever her name came up? Did anyone else remember the article with the ribbon cutting and wonder why it wasn't brought up at the table? I sat at the corner with a plate of pie I didn't eat, smiling politely while inside I could feel the tension growing like a string being pulled tighter and tighter. The beauty of it all was that no one could accuse me of starting anything, because technically I had only answered questions, only supplied facts that had been available all along. When Megan excused herself early, her smile brittle, and my mother's hands trembled just slightly as she stacked dessert plates, I knew the fuse I had lit was running fast toward something none of them could stop. I had not raised my voice, I had not broken a glass or staged a scene, but I had shifted the weight in the room so carefully that everything else tilted on its own. And when I drove home later, headlights bouncing off dark stretches of highway, I thought to myself that the setup had been almost too easy, that the real question wasn't whether they would unravel, but how loudly they would scream once they realized I had only pulled the thread they had been weaving around me for years. By the time I walked into my apartment, my phone already buzzing with messages, I poured myself water and let the screen glow unanswered. Because the truth was simple, by the time dessert hit the table, the fuse was already lit, and it was only a matter of watching where the sparks would land. If anyone were to ask me later what truly happened during dessert at that barbecue, I would not be able to give them a single explosive moment to point at, no overturned table or shrill argument to recall. Because what unfolded was not a sudden explosion, but rather a steady unraveling that began with a seemingly harmless question and ended with the room splintering into factions that my parents could no longer hold together. It was Uncle Nate who broke the seal, leaning back in his chair with a half-finished beer in his hand and asking, in that blunt way he has always had, why my father hadn't made his toast about both daughters instead of only one. He even chuckled as he asked it, as though he believed it was a light-hearted jab, but the air around the table shifted instantly, the kind of subtle tightening you notice only when people stop breathing for a second too long. My mother laughed first, a high and overly bright laugh that was meant to smooth over the gap, and she told Uncle Nate that of course they were proud of me. That they simply wanted to recognize Megan's big promotion, because everyone had already heard enough about my quiet little projects. She waved her hand as if brushing away crumbs, not realizing that her choice of words landed heavier than any deliberate insult, because when you reduce years of work into quiet little projects, you might as well carve insignificance into stone. Megan smiled at the table as though she were embarrassed by the attention, but the corners of her mouth tightened, betraying that she enjoyed every ounce of it. Cousin Daniel, who is never known for tact, leaned forward and said he had seen the article about my hospital project and that it seemed like a massive deal, something that actually affected lives rather than just a paycheck. And he asked why my parents had never mentioned it. My father shifted uncomfortably and muttered something about not wanting to brag, but Daniel wasn't letting go, because once the question is out there it lives in the air whether you answer it or not. My aunt, never one to resist stirring, chimed in that she thought it strange how the album I had shared showed a balance of both of us, and she wondered aloud why the celebration that afternoon had leaned so heavily to one side. That was the moment Megan snapped, though she tried to mask it with a tone of casual dismissal. She said, in front of everyone, that I had always been too sensitive, that I constantly twisted things to make myself the victim, and that maybe if I worked a little harder at being visible instead of sulking in corners, our parents would have more reasons to toast me. Her fiancé placed a hand on her arm to quiet her, but it was too late, because the room had already inhaled sharply, and every pair of eyes turned either toward her or toward me, waiting to see what I would do. I did nothing. I cut another small bite of pie and ate it slowly, chewing carefully, because silence at that moment was sharper than any retort. My mother tried to recover the evening by praising Megan again, but the words fell flat this time, like a balloon losing air, because the cousins and uncles had already seen the imbalance and were no longer willing to pretend it wasn't there. One of the children asked loudly why Auntie had no framed pictures on Grandma's wall, and although the room laughed awkwardly, the sting landed exactly where it needed to. My father snapped then, raising his voice not at Megan but at me, accusing me of planting seeds to embarrass the family, though he could not name a single lie I had told, because none existed. I had only ever answered questions, only ever put truths where they belonged, and it was their reactions, not my words, that had turned the evening into a battlefield. When Megan's eyes filled with tears and she excused herself from the table, no one followed her immediately, not even our mother, and I realized that for the first time the spotlight was not just on her absence, but on the silence that followed it. Plates clattered as people shifted uncomfortably, voices rose in fragmented attempts at small talk, and yet the underlying hum of tension refused to dissipate. My father stood rigid with his jaw set, my mother busied herself with collecting forks she didn't need to collect, and I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands neatly in my lap, wearing the look of someone who had no stake in the mess at all. The fireworks, if you could call them that, were not the sound of shouting or slamming doors, but the realization spreading across the room that the carefully constructed narrative of our family was cracking open right in front of them. And there was no way to tape it back together. I did not need to raise my voice, I did not need to accuse anyone, because every glance exchanged across that table confirmed that they saw what I had always seen, and once you see imbalance, you cannot unsee it. When Megan's chair scraped back and her footsteps echoed down the hallway, I knew the night had achieved exactly what I had set in motion, because by the time dessert hit the table the fuse had been lit, and now the fire was dancing across every corner of that house. Later, as I rinsed my plate at the sink, my mother whispered that she hoped I was happy, though her voice cracked in a way that betrayed fear more than anger, and I dried my hands slowly before answering that I hadn't done anything but exist. And maybe that was finally enough to make them notice. Her eyes flickered, wounded, and I left the kitchen before she could answer. The house behind me felt unsettled, like a stage after the curtain has fallen, but the smoke from the pyrotechnics still lingers. And as I walked to my car, I thought to myself that silence had carried me this far, and it would carry me further still, because Megan's text later that night, "Mom's in tears. What did you do?" was not just panic. It was proof that the fireworks had found their mark, and the echoes would not fade anytime soon. By the time Megan's message lit up my screen with its tidy question and its not-so-tidy panic, the apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the barely audible sigh that slipped out of me when I realized I was not actually angry anymore, just finished. Which is a different animal entirely, because anger still wants a response, while finished prefers a ledger, and mine, finally, balanced. I let her words sit there, "Mom's in tears. What did you do?" And I thought about how much history could be folded into a single line, how many dinners and birthdays and careful little cuts could hide under a neat string of characters. And then the phone rang with my father's name, and I knew we had arrived at the part of the story he had always believed he could skip by speaking with that patient, managerial tone that turns daughters into employees and disputes into policy. He did not ask how I was. He went straight to the point and asked if I had told anyone about the other thing, which was his clumsy phrase for the promise he once made on a shaky camcorder about equal treatment and equal support, a promise that aged like a coupon no one intended to honor. And I told him calmly that I had not told anyone anything that was not already theirs to know, because I had simply put all the family milestones in one place, and included the moments they preferred to remember selectively, which is not a confession. It is a filing system. He tried to explain the toast, the timing, the stress, the way the day got away from them, and then he drifted where he always drifts when backed into the smallest corner, into a sentimental fog about how parents do their best with the tools they have. And I let him talk until the fog thinned enough for a single clean sentence, which I placed carefully between us. "I am not asking you to undo what you did for Megan. I am asking you to admit you did not do it for me, and I am done pretending that was fair." Silence followed, the kind that stretches like a wire, And then he did what men in our family do when the wire starts to hum. He pivoted to logistics and asked me to take down the video clip of his promise, because your mother is embarrassed. And I said I could not oblige, not because I wanted to humiliate her, but because the clip is not a trap, it is a mirror, and we do not heal by covering mirrors with cloth. There is a particular kind of revenge that does not require destruction, only light, so I took one more small step that looked like housekeeping, but felt like a hinge turning, and I wrote to Grandma, who is kinder than all of us and sharp as a sewing needle, to tell her I had mailed a framed still from that old Sunday video where Dad's arm is around both of us, and the caption on the mat reads, "No exceptions," and I asked if she would hang it where the eyes land first when people walk into her living room. Not as a taunt, but as an anchor, because if we are going to keep telling this story together, I want the opening line to match the plot. I also sent the shared album link to the church committee planning my parents' anniversary luncheon, along with a short note that said I was proud of our family and that both daughters would be attending, which was not a threat or a tease, but a perfectly reasonable expectation set in public where it could gather spine. Megan called next, voice brittle and fast, and told me I had crossed a line by turning private things into communal theater, and I told her I understood her instinct to protect the version of the family where she shines uninterrupted. But that version had been paid for with a currency that was not hers alone, and if she could not see the arithmetic, then perhaps she needed to sit quietly with the ledger until the numbers stopped swimming. She said I was jealous, and I said I was finally visible, and there is a difference you can feel even with your eyes closed. Then, because pettiness tempts even the disciplined, I almost mentioned the way her fiancé's jaw had stiffened when I rearranged our truths within earshot, but I swallowed the impulse and chose a cleaner line of consequence instead, telling her I had emailed the alumni coordinator to add her achievements to the family album properly so that any future toast would have a script that included both of us in print, which was generous on the surface and also wonderfully inescapable beneath it, because once something sits in a program or a bulletin, it becomes difficult to pretend it never happened. My mother texted much later, a long message full of trembling apologies and careful justifications and a request that I come over to talk, and I agreed, but I picked the time and I set a condition that sounds small and is anything but small, which is that the conversation would happen in the living room beneath the photo wall and that before we spoke she would help me hang the missing frames, mine and not just mine, the ones from years that slipped past without ceremony, because if we cannot stand in the same room as our history, we are only rehearsing for more amnesia. When I arrived the next afternoon, the nails were waiting on the mantel and the hammer lay beside them like a peace offering, and we did the work slowly, side by side, while the house settled into an honest shape I had never seen it take. People expect a finale to roar, yet the most satisfying ending I can offer is quieter than thunder and sturdier than spectacle. I kept the album up, I kept the clip up, I sent thank you notes to the relatives who asked the rude, necessary questions, and I told my parents I would not be attending any celebration that required my invisibility as an entry fee, which is not melodrama but a boundary with teeth. Whether my father truly understood or only feared the optics I cannot say, and whether Megan forgave me or simply recalibrated her smile is a mystery I have decided not to solve, because there is power in letting some things remain unsorted. On the night before the church luncheon, I received a new text from my sister, one line that said, "Are you coming or are you making another point?" And I stared at it for a long breath before answering that I would be there if the program reflected the family we keep insisting we are, the one with 2 daughters whose names belong side by side. She wrote back a single word, fine, which might have been surrender or strategy. I left it unopened to interpretation. So yes, Mom cried and Dad worried and cousins whispered and some portion of the myth cracked like sugar on top of a creme brulee, and if you want to call that revenge you can, though I will tell you it felt more like architecture. A careful redrawing of load-bearing walls, so the whole house could stop pretending it was not leaning. I cannot promise that future toasts will always remember me, and I cannot promise that the ledger will never tempt someone to cook its numbers again, but I can promise that silence, once my camouflage, has become my instrument. And if anyone wonders what I did, the answer fits neatly into a single sentence. I turned on the lights and refused to flip them off, and now they have to decide whether to see.